Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Having been in the Christchurch earthquake in 2011, I've got to say the simulation is nowhere near as dramatic as the real thing. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now get underway, and I'll declare the meeting open with the affirmation. Tēnā tātou katoa, we seek wisdom, understanding, insights into the views and circumstances of others, strength to seek what we believe in, humility to accept the combined decisions of others, patience, good humour at all times, tolerance and courtesy while working in the best interests of our community. We come to apologies. I have received apologies from Councillor Kathy Casey on leave of absence, Councillor Penny Hulse for absence, and Councillor Greg Sayers on absence on council business. Are there any other apologies? If not, I move that we accept the apologies from the three councillors and Councillor Bartley for lateness.
Second.
Been seconded by Councillor Collins. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. Declaration of interest. Are there any councillors that have an interest that they need to disclose for any agenda item today?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
For Waitemata and Gulf Ward.
Thank you, Councillor Lee.
Well, Your Worship,
Councillor Fletcher.
it's my personal view that I have a conflict if I enter into the debate on the recommendations of the Joint Governing Body Working Party, because I do believe we all have conflict to be discussing and debating our own boundaries. I have registered this before, but I will not be participating in the discussion because I think it's inappropriate. I think it should be done at arm's length. So I'm just being consistent with my view on this.
Thank you. It's of course up to individual councillors to make an assessment of their interests. In this regard, I guess all of us have the interest, well, all of the councillors, ward councillors have an interest because it's relating to the boundaries of the ward council. I don't know, Marguerite, if you want to just explain how the rules would appropriately apply in this case for discussion of item number 8.
Sorry, excuse me, I should do the same then, Your Worship, because obviously the Ōrākei ward is significantly affected by the discussions today.
We have a difficulty, of course, if the proposed boundary changes were wider, there would be nobody left to vote on whether these were the representations we were making to the Local Government Commission. So I'm just going to ask, if I may, first of all, for Marguerite to explain how the conflict of interest rule would work in the instance of item number 8 on the agenda, the review of representation arrangements.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I should start by saying that this is a question that the members of the Joint Working Party did ask us at the beginning. And the answer that we gave is that if you keep an open mind and look at the merits of the proposals, and by legislation, it is the council that makes those decisions. So while it feels uncomfortable, we are following the legislation and asking you to make those decisions. If you feel more comfortable abstaining in the debate around your ward, I mean, that's absolutely your choice. My advice to all of you would be to keep an open mind in considering all the different changes that are there, and not make decisions that would that affect you personally. Does that
Your
make
Worship,
sense?
in clarification, it's not just about my ward. I just feel that this is perhaps something that advocacy should be brought to central government on, because it is impossible to divorce yourself completely from whether it might be one councillor you may like over another, or it's human nature that you will have a view on this, and I feel distinctly uncomfortable. It's not about Albert Eden Roskill, but just the whole process. And I appreciate that democracy services have to work within the context of what is required. However, I'm registering my displeasure and my discomfort, and believe it's something that at some future point, when the government of the day may wish to come and spend time with councillors and discuss issues that we should raise with them.
Thank you. I think if I interpret what Margarita said, everybody will have a view. The question is whether you have closed off your mind to other points of view that might lead to wanting to make a declaration that there may be a conflict. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Could I just make a very brief explanation? I declared an interest because I declared an interest, and I believe quite properly, in the report that I submitted to the council, which was included in the meeting, the agenda for the meeting at which we last discussed the representation review. I do not believe at all that I have a conflict of interest. I won't go into too much political details. Arguably, it's the opposite. But I do have an interest, and it's important that when people do have a personal interest, they're declared. It's somewhat different from a conflict of interest. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification, Councillor. If there's no other comment on it, the situation is such that if you feel that you have an interest that's incompatible with your voting on the item, then that is up to you to make that judgment. I accept, Councillor Fletcher, that there's a lot of grey area around this. There's not a perfect solution, but the best interpretation I've heard is, yes, of course you'll have a view, but the question is around whether you have an openness of mind to listen to the arguments prevailing around it. At the end of the day, we all will cast a vote, or all of us who intend to vote will cast a vote on what we think the best outcome is. So it's not perfect, but I think that's about as good a clarification as we're going to get on it. Okay, I'll move on. There are no petitions. There is no public input or local board input today within those sectors. I know that there are local boards represented here that will wish to speak to item number 8. I'm aware of no extraordinary item for the agenda. Therefore, we come to the review of representation arrangements, item number 8. And there are 2 local boards that will have speaking rights under this particular sector. And maybe if I invite both of them to come to the table. Mangere o Tapahu Local Board, Lamunga Lydia Soseni. Lydia, welcome today. And Chair of Puke Tapapa Local Board, Harry Doig. I see David Holmes is here from the board if he wishes to come too. And Walter, very welcome to the table. Any other board members? Actually, we've got quite a few from the area there. So, if we maybe start, Lydia, with you. Welcome back to the governing body, and the usual process of 5 minutes and the chance for questions to be asked at the end of it.
Sure. And thank you, Mayor, and also councillors, for the opportunity to come back to speak to the governing body with regards to the representation review, item number 8. As you may have already heard, and you would have read the report, that the proposal or in the report in terms of the Manukau ward split, really here to reinforce the feedback that has been received from Mangere Ōtāhuhu community, but also Ōtara Papatoetoe communities. I do bring apologies of Chair Lutufuli. However, her members are here, and our member Otatongia Moa, Dawn, and Apulu Reese. And really, it is to reinforce that we were concerned when the item came up. We asked a number of questions. We entered into a consultation process. The community has spoken, and we wholeheartedly support the Working Party, and we thank the Working Party for their work, and we did raise a number of queries. What is important to our communities in the Manukau ward, that when ideas or motions are put forward, that there is the opportunity for our communities to speak, that local board has representation, that we would respect the process, but we want to give a firm view that the split is not to occur, that we remain as a ward and we would continue on this journey. And why? Because we have specific communities of interest. We want them to have their say. We want to be able to present in a respectful manner, in a firm manner, that our communities, we keep the work from local boards and communities. That is basically our brief every single day. And it is important that our communities and the diversity of voices and the diversity of views takes heed of the process, but also enters into to have their say. So, Mr. Mayor, that's basically our presentation. We have presented before. We thank you for the opportunity to affirm our view, Mangere Otahuhu, or Tara Papatoetoe. I'm just going to ask my colleagues if they had anything to add with 20 seconds, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, Dawn or Reese, would you like to add anything, or Walter?
Whakalawalai atu, happy New Zealand Language Week. Just on behalf of the Otara Papatoetoe Local Board, we support what Chair Lemonga has said. And I guess in the July governing body meeting, the comments from councillors was that it needs to go out to public consultation. That's been done. 78% of Otara Papatoetoe oppose the split, 80% of Mangere Otahuhu. That's a clear indication from the people, from the public, that they do not want a split. I just ask, in our resolution from the Otara Papatoetoe Local Board, we ask that those wishes be respected. Thank you very much. Mahalo.
Thank you very much. No other comments on this sector. I'm presuming Puki Te Papa's got a different issue, so maybe we'll take questions from Mangere Otahuhu and Otara Papatoetoe if there are any questions. Councillor Simpson.
I'm really interested in the feedback that you received. I think it's great. It's really, really high. How would you rate this with regards to feedback on other council issues?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Simpson. It's an indication, Councillor Simpson, that when our communities understand the question that's being asked, are provided with the opportunity to have their view in a manner that they understand, they'll get engaged. So in terms of this, this issue, there was a concern that there was, what is the question, what is the purpose of the question, and what is the outcome? And then what follows is what is the benefit to the communities of Otara Papatoetoe, Mangere Otahuhu. And so the translation that we've all picked up as local boards, when the community understands the question, because if I could just say, amalgamation has occurred since 2000, but there is still, sorry, 2010. There is still a confusion as to local boards and what local boards actually do. And so when local boards have had the opportunity to speak with their communities with the help of Auckland Council staff, that then highlights that there is a desire to get involved when they understand what's being asked of them.
So with respect, Your Worship and Madam Chair, I think this is a lesson for us for many things, for many issues. And that is that we don't have trouble actually engaging, because you know often the numbers are quite low, with responses on other issues. There's no problem in the engagement. The problem is actually understanding the question, and I think we need to do more to help you in the future. But this has been a very good learning for us, and I think it's a great reflection on the work that you have done and your community, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions? Sorry, I've got Councillor Whanana, Professor Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. My question is to both local boards, and welcome. Great to see the two strongest local boards in the city. I just wanted to ask, I understand that there was a bit of a Facebook campaign as well that you got information out. I'm interested, Lemonga and maybe others, if you could just drill down a little bit more, because I've always been concerned about the way in which we engage communities that traditionally we haven't had many responses from. You talked about Lemonga understanding what was being asked. I was just wondering if you could just kind of delve down and see if there are learnings that we can take as far as our engagement team is concerned, so that we can start applying that on a more general basis.
Thank you, Councillor Collins. If I could just highlight a couple of things very quickly and illustrate. So this issue about representation review, there was a lot of keenness from those, because our Facebook pages are really busy. We, as local boards, use them for education. We use them to just bring people up to speed, particularly those with a second language, third, fourth. And so Facebook, whether we like it or not, is the tool that we have chosen to put some real positive messaging, but also the relevance of that messaging. And both boards use those quite keenly, but also it's about engagement. The long-term plan that we've just had this year, we utilised that as a tool. We got 3 community leaders, Pacific, Māori, ethnic, young people, 30-second message. We got over 18,000 hits.
That's great.
So what that tells you is people are wanting the message. They don't want to sit through council forms of 3 to 4 pages, but they do like specific 4 questions. What does this mean to you? So I hope I've just helped highlight that difference.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. It's a lesson for future engagement. Okay, and I've got.
Sorry,
finally-
Mr. Mayor, could I just add?
Yeah.
If there is an eagerness from all local boards across the region, there does need to be some serious thinking from our citizens and engagement, but also resource and the relevance of our people getting out there, informing those messages and education. So I just wanted to put that in. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, thank you, Lamonga. Whilst I've long been sceptical about the split option, I just want you to clarify for me, if you can, your understanding that the only reason that split option was considered in this particular ward, the Manukau ward, is that this is the only ward which, on the basis of a population split, the split option was possible, that the local boards in that ward have comparable populations numbers, and so statistically this was the only location where that option could be considered.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. If I could just revert back to what you've just asked. Perhaps the message of why Manukau was eligible in the first place, that message may not have been understood as clear as probably mud. However, the first questions that we were receiving, both boards, what is the purpose, what is the benefit for communities of interest? That's probably one of the key aspects. So just in terms of the definition, it is about keeping it simple, keeping it relevant. So if Manukau ward was the only ward eligible for a split, why was that? There needs to be the definition as clear as possible in a very shortened version. I don't know if that answers your question.
I know that's helpful, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, a big thank you, Lamonga, to Dawn, to Apulu and to Walter. You're welcome to remain at the table while Harry does his presentation. Harry, welcome.
Thank you.
And to David.
Thank you, Your Worship, and councillors, tēnā koutou e hui mai nei. So, interesting enough, our main, I have two points. Our first one, perhaps the main one, is also about councillor representation. And we do see councillor representation as an equity issue, and but we do acknowledge, as Lamonga has eloquently said, that there are reasons for staying the way we are and there are reasons for splitting. For the Puki Tāpapa board, there's strong feeling, but perhaps not as strong as been represented by our sister boards in the south, that in our ward it could well be split. It doesn't split so neatly, but that mould has been broken anyway by the increase in population, where neat matches of ward to local board boundaries that no longer exists. So I think we're now overlapping our ward. Our proposed ward is now overlapping 3 different boards. So that neatness is no longer there. There was a mathematical equality, if you like, by saying, oh, well, we've got roughly 180,000 people, but we've got 2 ward councillors, therefore that's about 90,000 each, which is pretty close to the average across the city. But then the reality of that is actually quite different, especially at election time, have your say events, even attending local board meetings, the workload or representing constituents on regional issues, the workload actually in reality for our ward is twice. Our ward councillors work twice as hard to actually cover those issues. We do feel that there's an equality issue there, but we do feel that this is an issue that should be addressed on a ward-by-ward basis, and therefore absolutely acknowledge the right of our sister boards to take the decision that they have. We have an issue with community of interests. It's pretty hard to find a community of interest between the communities of Epsom and the communities of Wesley. So we don't have that same prerogative, if you like, to actually have that maintain the ward boundaries as they were. Our main concern would be that for the councillors, an equality of representation would best be served by splitting our ward. So, we have a different issue from the others. The other issue I just want to briefly mention is the naming of the wards. In the past, the naming of the Albert Eden Roskill ward has not reflected Puki-Tāpapa, so that was an issue for us. Again, this is going to be an increasingly difficult task as wards get more and more separated from the boards that they overlap, but we would recommend to the governing body that Puki-Tāpapa be recognised, given that the majority, some of our ward is actually, our board is actually in another ward as well now, as recommended, but the majority of it will be along with Albert Eden and Puki-Tāpapa combined. So that's all from me. I think David probably would like to add a couple of...
Could I just clarify how much time I've got left?
About a minute and a half.
I've put up two papers, one which takes about 12 minutes to read, so it'll have to be read separately, obviously. The other paper is what was put up to the working party, which is key arguments that is attached to the minutes of the working party, but for easiness I've copied it off again. But the striking figure that hit us is it's now 177,800 people, and to say that two people can be accessible when they're representing that number of people is ridiculous. I know the mayor has 1.5 million people, but he does have rather more support than a councillor has to make him accessible. But in addition, the arguments we put to the working party, communities of interest for Manukau, there's an overriding thing to do with ethnic fairness. In our area, there's significant contrasts, and I've highlighted 4 of them. The first is socio-economic status, and I extracted figures of property values from the New Zealand Herald's latest property report, and for the proposal then, which included Westmere, there were 4 suburbs with around $2 million property values. Then when you get into Puki-Tāpapa and parts of Owairaka, they're about half the property values. So that illustrates a socio-economic difference, which is hard for a councillor to represent both easily. Second point is that in Puki-Tāpapa and the Owairaka part of Albert Eden, Housing New Zealand has some massive projects, including at Unitec and Roskill South, and these projects are of key interest to people in that part of the ward, and will have considerable council involvement in building good communities out of those developments. So there's a synergy there between Owairaka and Puketapapa, which would be served by having a separate councillor. The third point is to do with the environment, and we've had big projects in Oakley Creek. The catchment of Oakley Creek matches very neatly to Puketapapa plus Owairaka, Sandringham and Waterview. The original proposal fitted that in a split was very easy to do using that catchment and for people in Point Chevalier, Epsom and Mount Eden, there was a good geographic synergy. The new proposal changes that a bit, but we are going to ask the Local Government Commission to have an investigation if you approve that. The other thing is population trends, partly because of the redevelopments. Our populations are growing much faster where the Housing New Zealand development is than in the eastern part, but we feel that so for the future this is going to happen anyway, and all around the city there's population disparities coming up in the next 10 years. They're well documented in council documents, and so this trying to fit boundaries to local board boundaries. We're happy with local board boundaries, but to try and fit wards to that just doesn't work. If it worked, Parliament would do the same thing. So we very strongly feel that our communities of interest do need a split, and we're asking, our request on the last page is that the council recommendation adds the wording asking the Local Government Commission to investigate. We're not asking for a definitive decision today, but asking the Local Government Commission to investigate the different communities of interest and look at us having two separate wards rather than a combined ward. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Harry and David. The item on the agenda that we will be voting on today is, of course, the change of name that you've requested. In regard to your request here, the difficulty is that we haven't been out and consulted on that. So that that doesn't diminish the argument you're putting forward, but it means that we have not gone through the process that the Local Government Commission would request of us. I wonder, Warwick McNaughton, if I can get Warwick just to come to the table to explain what the difficulty was in putting up a proposal for the division of the Albert. Maybe if you just take a seat there, Warwick. What the difficulty was in terms of creating that split in this instance that did not exist in theory in the Manukau ward.
It's really to do with defining communities of interest, and our starting point really was that the creation of local boards was based on communities of interest, so we took local board boundaries as the starting point, really. It is possible to create an artificial boundary to split Albert, Eden, Puketapapa ward, either horizontally or vertically, but it is rather artificial.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, are there any questions from councillors from the Puketapapa board? Yep, Councillor Darby.
Probably just need to check the recommendation, what is it? It's coming under additional, it's top of page 8, to change the name to Albert Eden Puketapapa. Was that consulted on?
Your Worship, no, that wasn't part of the initial proposal. It was raised with us through the local board.
Okay, so has that been canvassed with maybe the IMSB or Mana Whenua? Because we've got effectively Owairaka, Maungakiekia, Puketapapa, and we've got one in Te Reo and two in English. I know there's dual naming there. Has there been some consideration of the implications of that proposal?
We did get advice internally through Te Waka Aramua. They were happy with it.
Perhaps can Puketapapa shed any light on whether there's been any local consultation with relevant iwi on that?
No, we haven't consulted with iwi on that.
Okay, thank you.
So just to follow up, I can understand Puki Tāpapa's interest there. I'm just wondering, does the Albert Eden Board have any interest in that, in reflecting the te reo names of the maunga while we're at it?
I don't know whether you guys are in a position to comment on that, but if you feel you are, please.
Sorry, I can't. I wouldn't dare
Yeah.
comment for Albert Eden.
Yeah, I think the difference, councillor, is that there is the Albert Eden wards that are called that, but Puki Te Papa is called Puki Te Papa, not Roskill. So
Yeah, I get that.
the change in name simply reflects what we've already labelled the local board area. So I don't imagine there is a problem there, but we can maybe canvass that further when we come to discussing the recommendations. Look, if we... Oh, sorry, Councillor Simpson.
Sorry, Your Worship, I was just picking up a thread, and it might be appropriate to ask it later, but why are we voting on something that we haven't consulted on?
I wasn't
I'm not
aware
voting.
until the question was asked by Councillor Darby that it hadn't been consulted on. But maybe once we enter into the broader discussion, perhaps Richard Northey will be able to comment further on that. Warwick, you can make a comment at this
Just
point.
to make a brief comment that the legislation recognises that there will be proposals made as part of the final proposal which weren't part of the initial proposal. And so it specifically allows for objections to changes to the initial proposal.
Yeah. I think the scale of the change and the fact that the local board is already called Puki Tā Papa makes it different from suddenly proposing that we split the ward, which is a decision of much wider implications. That's my personal view on it. Okay, if I can move a vote of thanks to our local board members. Have I got a seconder for that? Councillor Collins. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. And local board members are, of course, welcome to stay for the discussion that's now going to take place.
Thank you.
Coming to item 8, I'm happy to move unless there's somebody else that would prefer to move the recommendations.
I'm happy to move them as the Deputy of the Governance Review Committee.
Okay, it's been moved by Councillor Cooper, seconded by Councillor Newman. And if I can ask at this stage Richard Northey, Chair of the Joint Governance Working Party, to come to the table to introduce it, and joined by Warwick at that end of the table and Marguerite at this end of the table, and Brian. I don't know whether Brian wants to come to the table as well. Well, welcome to Brian. Richard, you might like to start off with the introduction to the recommendations in the report.
Well, thank you, Your Worship, for giving me this task, and which is a little easier than the Herculean, the Augean stables, I guess. But I want to thank my fellow Working Party members for their diligence and commitment in working on this, and also to the staff members who also responded to all the requests and gave advice that was appropriate. As has been said, just about the first question we asked was about the potential issue for conflict of interest in this matter. The reality is that Parliament has declared that this body is to be the body responsible for drawing up those, recommending those representation issues. And in that sense, potentially all boundaries were up for review, could have been changed, and therefore, in a sense, you're all equally involved in that issue. It's interesting that the law does not allow local board boundaries to be changed by this process, and half of the members of the Working Party were local board members, including myself, who could not be affected by these. The reality is there was no
difference between the local board members of the working party and the governing body members of the working party in being diligent and impartial in carrying out the task. So the law says so, that is the responsibility, and in practice that should be done. It's interesting, as my memo subsequently says, that there have been examples of parliaments in which the boundaries were drawn up by the members of parliament itself, have resulted in continuing grossly unfair representation. And there are many states in the US and the United States who draw up their own boundaries and do a lot of gerrymandering. As I said, I've not found that from the working party members, nor indeed from the other members of the governing body, that they have displayed any attempt to get political advantage from that process in practice. In terms of the issues that were before us, I'll concentrate on the ones that were contentious. Obviously, the proposal to split the Manukau ward. We believed it was important to hear the views of the locality, the people who lived in that area on the issue, and there was a huge response from that population, which is really encouraging. Not all the reasons given in the submissions are relevant to the criteria we're obliged to apply, but they're all passionately and genuinely felt. But among those reasons that were given, that were relevant, there was a very clear majority view that in terms of the criteria, in community of interest and the like, it was best to retain the two-member ward, and we unanimously accepted that viewpoint. With respect to other non-conforming proposals, in terms of the plus or minus 10% rule, there was no concern raised about Manuara Papakura being having a minor deviation from it. In Rodney, the community of interest, we weren't able to come up with a boundary that better met the community of interest and as a distinctively rural ward as established by the Local Government Commission. That was acceptable. It's interesting that we have proposed a tweak in the internal representation of the Rodney Local Board, which you could argue wasn't what we put out for proposal, was a different one, but that is what the process brings up as a response, new and better ways of carrying that out. There is within another board area, that of Howick, underrepresentation for the Botany ward. Botany is an area that has an unfortunate record of picking their parliamentary representation, and one would hope that they have better luck, continue to have better luck with respect to their representation on their local board. But the reality was that there was no concern expressed by the people from that area. With respect to the name of Puketapapa, it is an accepted name for the local board area, and although it was an issue that came up as a result of putting it out for consultation, we believe that that would help to identify the area covered by the councillors. That's a matter for you to decide on, but we did feel that a substantial change in the ward boundaries had come too late to be acceptable as a change that should be made. I think it was important, given that there was substantial concern raised about the proposed Isthmus ward boundaries, and particularly about the boundaries of the boundaries for the Waitemataran Golf Ward, that I should address those issues. our view was that the principle of fair and equal representation, which is set out in the law, both for reasons of law and of equity, needed to be responded to in changing the boundaries at that stage. The plus or minus 10% is just an expression of that principle of fair and equal representation, and the reality is the Local Government Commission takes it seriously, as they're obliged to follow the law, and they have not previously agreed within a continuous urban area to changes greater than 20%, which, as you know, we started with an underrepresentation at the 44% level. So we're required to base our numbers for this purpose on the latest Department of Statistics estimates of usually resident population. They don't include visitors and short-term residents. They do include people who are somewhat transient, and there are a lot of them in that area. But I found when I was the councillor for Mongakiki Tamaki, we had a lot of short-term residents as well, people on lower incomes who would move with their family and whānau to different parts of Auckland at different times. And it's important that they be counted somewhere at the place when they filled in the census form that they regarded was the place they are more linked to than anywhere else. And even if you took those transient people out, they'd still be well over 35%. Then it's important to go back to the principle of that total population, which was set out in the 1887 Representation Act, reviewed again by the Royal Commission on the Electoral System in 1986. And as I've said there, the general argument is that everyone is affected by the decisions of the government, as they are of the council, and therefore everyone should be equally represented in the body that makes their decisions. Incapacity to vote, whether by age or transience, does not apply that the individuals concerned should be ignored. So there is a relatively low voter turnout in the Waitemata Gulf ward, and that appears to reflect the high proportion of young people, recent permanent migrants, and poor and alienated people living in the central city area in particular. We believe the principle should continue to apply for those people, and if we were applying something in which only the adult voters should be counted in terms of representing fair representation, then the Southern Initiative area would lose a councillor. And that would be seen quite clearly as discriminatory, and I think it would, if we were to not count those people in Waitemata Gulf, it would be discriminatory as well. I think we need to address it now. There are going to continue to be changes in population, and the likelihood is, and we simply have to, each time we review the boundaries, make those changes to ensure fair representation of new and emerging communities as they occur. We knew that were we to be allowed to add another councillor, we could have had less disruptive changes. That an additional representative could have been fitted into the isthmus, but the law doesn't allow us, and we argued for it. New Zealand First Party appears irrevocably opposed to allowing an increase in the number of councillors, and they're probably still going to be around in one government or another in the future. So we have to respond to the law as it is. We have to balance community of interest and fair representation, and we've ended up with populations somewhat over the 10% for both Waitemata Gulf and Ōrākei in order to achieve community of interest. But we need to recognise that the council has changed from the councils which we're used to, in which there were community boards which simply moved with ward boundaries when they needed to be changed. We've now got a system in which We have fixed local boards, and the staffing are organised on that basis to provide advice and support to facilities and services based on those areas. And it would be very disruptive to change those every time we're required to change the ward boundaries, and it's just something we need to get used to. As I've said, both in Britain and here, previously the council boundaries were also used for parliamentary boundaries. We've recognised for fair representation that they don't need to be changed artificially to fit each other, and in the longer term the local board boundaries should be respected as the main community of interest with respect to local decisions, and the council wards will fit them as much as they can, but it's just one criteria of community of interest. So were we not to make any changes, I think the Local Government Commission would certainly change them. We've done our best to come up with boundaries that meet both community of interest and fair representation. Were we to simply go out with the existing ones, the Local Government Commission would come up with its own boundaries which would fit less well with community of interest than what we've proposed. We can't wash our hands of that. We've just got to do our best on that, and I hope that the governing body will accordingly. Thank you. And thank you for the interesting experience.
Yeah, well, a big thank you, not only to Richard, but the whole of the Governance Working Party, but Richard in particular for, you can tell from the full and thorough report we've just heard how much time and effort that has gone into that. So thank you, Richard, for you and your group. Warwick, do you want to add anything to that? I suggested beforehand that Richard would be pretty thorough. You might not have anything further to add, but feel welcome to if you do.
Just a couple of short comments. One, Mr Northey acknowledged the worker staff. I'd like to acknowledge those staff that have been assisting us behind the scenes, and that's our citizens and engagement team and our comms team, our web content team and so on. The other point that I'd like to make is just to note that there was a separate set of submissions that was distributed after the agenda was published. These were submissions that we left off the original agenda, so just to remind you that you have those.
Thank you, Warwick. Look, I want to divide this up into questions first and then comments. And I think because a number of councillors have expressed concern that they may have an interest that prevents them from voting on some sections, we'll take the vote in sections so that those councillors are free to vote on the other sectors of the report. I think that makes sense. But let's start with questions first. Are there any questions? I know we've workshopped this, so you're probably pretty familiar with it, but Councillor Lee.
Thank you, and thank you, Richard and Warwick. Could you remind the governing body again, in response to your original proposal that the governing body supported the last time you presented? I think it was 9 votes to 7 or 11 votes to 7. What was the response in regard to the Waitemata and Gulf population? What percentage of submissions supported your proposal, and what proportion of submissions strongly opposed your proposal?
It was about 2 to 1 against the proposal, and principally those were about the proposal to remove half of Grey Lynn and all of Westmere from.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Sorry to say, I'm just sorry.
Point of order.
I'm just confused.
Councillor Cooper.
I heard Councillor Lee declare a conflict for this item at the beginning, so I...
No, he declared an interest, but not a conflict. He declared
I listened carefully to
sorry.
what Councillor Lee said. He said, and he clarified it in his comments, that he had an interest, but didn't believe he had a conflict.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Thank you very much for clarifying.
That's okay. Richard?
So most of them were against, and most of them were because they opposed the proposal to divide.
I just asked the percentage. It was 88% of the population
Within 2 to
opposed
1,
your
fine.
proposal. Thank you.
Okay. Further questions? Councillor Cooper.
No, mine wasn't a
Oh,
question.
sorry, that was
No,
your point of order.
No.
If there are no further questions, we'll just move straight, I think, into comments. So the floor is open for any comments on the proposals. Don't feel obliged to comment if you've already talked in earlier sessions about it.
Okay,
Councillor Cooper.
First, I just want to acknowledge Member Northey for his chairing of this process. It was quite a complicated process and lengthy, so I just want to acknowledge him for the work and the great forward that he put into the report and the thought that he's put into this. What I just did want to say, I think that it's not an easy recommendation at times, because people do get very concerned about either not being represented properly, but I think we've come to quite a good landing point. One thing I just wanted to note, and I said this at the workshop, was, and it's a little bit in line with what Councillor Simpson was saying earlier about lessons learned, and I think that even after 8 years, in one of the submitters, when we explained to them that the splitting of a particular community would not mean they would lose their local board, they were quite stunned. They thought they were going to have to be on one side of the road, go to one local board, and the other side of the road, go to another local board. And they didn't realise that they would keep their local board and that local representation, which is really critical to them. And so that was really, it's just really interesting to see the look on their faces when they realised, oh, I see, actually we'll have 2 councillors if the change was made. But still, we did hear what they said, and that was really important to listen to that, and that's where we've landed. But I think that's something for us as a council to really help educate people about what our roles are and how their representation sits, because I still think there's a lot of confusion even after 8 years. But otherwise, it was a really good process. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper, and thank you for being Deputy Chair of that committee. Councillor Newman.
Thank you. I want to make a couple of comments about this as a member of the Representation Review Panel, and I too echo the thanks to the staff for the work that they have done, and for the good humour that members of the panel brought to the deliberation, and to acknowledge Richard Northey for chairing it. Your Worship, I commenced my role on the Representation Review Panel by really wanting to affirm one vote, one value, and I have always felt that the best way to do that would actually be the removal of the wards and elections at large, because then you just remove all of this debate around boundaries and communities of interest within that. But of course that creates new challenges, and it's pretty apparent that that there would not be support at this time for the elections at large. Your Worship, paragraph 55, the table in paragraph 55 absolutely outlines the dilemma whereby one ward is 43% at variance from the population quota. I thought that the submissions, and I want to acknowledge Councillor Mike Lee for the paper that he presented, which is very compelling. There is very compelling argument around the existing boundary, but for that number. And so one of the challenges, if there were going to be ward boundaries, was to be how can you address the issue of one vote, one value, whilst trying to achieve the statutory requirement to design wards that reflect communities of interest. And that really is the dilemma that the Representation Review Panel had to address. Now, it is absolutely true that there was a lot of opposition to changes to ward boundaries within the Central Isthmus. And the recommendations reflect, I think, quite a concerted attempt to try and address that concern whilst trying to overcome the wide variation from the quota as set out at paragraph 55. And that is why the Representation Review Panel resolved, from my interpretation, the decision in relation to the Western Bays, the Greylin and Westmere. The adjustment to align with the existing boundary at Greylin and Westmere required a consequential adjustment to the eastern side of the Waitemata and Gulf Ward. And that is why the change has been recommended that affects the Orake Ward. The consequences in the Orake Ward meant that there needed to be an adjustment, and that's what affects the Maungakiki Tamaki local ward. Some of us considered going further than that, but it came back to communities of interest arguments. So I will, notwithstanding the fact that I don't believe that I'm going to be universally popular for this, support the recommendations as it affects the isthmus wards. The other thing that I'll say is that given that there was a need to reflect communities of interest, because of the changes in the Western Bays around Greylin and Westmere, there was no need to proceed with the initial proposal to split Lindfield between Albert, Eden, Roskill and Foe. And so I'm happy with the outcome there. The final point that I'll say, Your Worship, and that is with respect to the Manukau ward split option, that while I've always been personally sceptical about that option, it is entirely within the purview of the governing body to consider it. It was considered. I thought that the consultation was helpful. The Manukau ward option is the only ward where you could actually consider the split because of populations between the local boards. But in the end, the recommendation that we landed on in the Manukau ward reflects the communities of interest argument. So, Your Worship, I'm happy to second the recommendations, and I'll vote for all parts.
Thank you, Councillor, and thank you for your contribution to the Working Party as well. Councillor John Watson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and I'd just like to add my thanks to everyone involved in the process. Obviously very challenging, and I think by and large the recommendations have come down in response to what the fairly significant feedback from the public, and it just goes to show, despite all the lack of awareness of the Auckland Council, people across Auckland still do retain a very strong sense of their identity, political as much as anything, and that came through very strongly in the submissions, and I don't think it should be discarded lightly. So in that respect, and I know it's stating the obvious, but the Super City is so different from the other councils around New Zealand that these reviews apply to, not just with the 20 ward councillors, the local board members, but also, throw in unelected IMSB members, 9 of those, CCO directors, 25 of those, who arguably have more control and influence than the elected members. So it's a very complex setup, and if you throw in the unique circumstances of the one ward I want to focus on, that's the Waitemata and Gulf Ward, then it becomes even more difficult again to actually really represent everyone in the manner that perhaps we would hope is possible, and we hope emerges from these recommendations. And I, like Councillor Newman, would like to acknowledge the sterling work of Councillor Lee in researching this issue, and in particular this distinction between population and electors, which I don't think is easily dismissed as we perhaps would like to. Across New Zealand as a whole, Councillor Lee has said that roughly sits at around about 70%, but in the Waitemata and Gulf, it's significantly lower at 51%. And of course, we know why that is, because a huge proportion of students and transient workers. By recommending to move the high voting areas of Parnell and Grafton, and along with Newmarket to Ōrākei, I think that very important distinction with electors and population gets lost. So Councillor Lee has said focusing on the population is really, in his ward anyways, at the expense of the effective representatives of communities of interest. And if anything has come through in the submissions, it is the arguments that have been put up for these communities of interest, and particularly from Waitemata and Gulf, and in these very historic areas that go to the essence of the city. So Grafton, for instance, its cricket club base is right in the centre of Victoria Park, oldest cricket club in New Zealand going back to 1860. That's where it is located. So the cultural, sporting and political mix is very much centred around everything to do with the Waitemata and Gulf ward. So I think that the 88%, I think that was referred to, that opposed and opposed strongly, I guess a percentage of them have been satisfied through Grey Lynn and Westmere, but certainly not in these very historic, very inner city suburbs of Parnell and Grafton and Newmarket. And I think the remedy put up by Councillor Lee is one that I support in this instance, and that's to kind of retain the status quo, because these clearly established communities of interest are being divided up. And we have seen that this matters to people. It's not some kind of academic sort of pursuit. It goes to their political identity. It goes to how they see themselves within their, their elected representation. So I agree entirely with all the other recommendations. I think they've done a sterling job there. I see the great question that's posed with this particular ward. I understand the difficult decision that's had to be made there, but I don't think it's the right one. I think it should be communities of interest that supersede the strict base population analysis that's really driving this recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wayne Walker.
So I just want to make a few comments. I was also on the panel, and like the other members of the panel, I think we landed on something that was fairly pragmatic. I certainly endorse the comments of my fellow councillors that were on the panel around the contribution of Councillor Lee and the sentiments that he expresses, and certainly the overriding comment that we got from people from the community was around their concern that goes to communities of interest and not splitting communities of interest. So we did the best we could not to split communities of interest where it was possible, and pragmatically, as far as Waitemata was concerned, recognised that if we did not make a call, there was a high likelihood that the local government commission would override us and conceivably have something that was even less satisfactory in terms of communities of interest. What I'm mindful of, and I raised it during the process, is frankly, in a few years' time, this is all going to come out in the wash again, because the growth of the Waitemata area is arguably more so than anywhere else in Auckland, and it may be at a later point that we'll have two members for that ward, and we will revert to perhaps something similar to the boundaries that we've had before. So I think we need to take somewhat of a longer-term perspective. One of the other observations I made in the process was really the lack of knowledge that people have got out there around what councillors do, and this relationship between representation and population, which may not necessarily be the case. Issues around what's happening in a ward, particularly in Waitemata, we've got a lot of development are probably much more relevant in terms of the amount of time and effort and focus that a member has to apply to something. So I think we could do more in terms of informing Aucklanders about what councillors do. And the other thing that I'll speak to briefly was the overwhelming support that we had from the Manukau community around retaining their identity, retaining the demographic nature of that ward and the Pacifica community, and I completely endorse that. I think that was overwhelming, and it's a little disappointing that we even had to visit it, frankly, because I thought it was self-evident to start with.
Thank you very much, councillors, and thank you for the constructive contributions that have been made. I'm sorry, Councillor Lee, you wanted to make... yeah,
yes,
okay.
I'll be brief, Mr Mayor. We've rehearsed these arguments on a number of occasions, so I don't want to take up too much time. I am concerned that I don't think the unusual nature of Central Auckland, Waitemata division of Waitemata and Gulf, is still not really understood in terms of the Local Electoral Act. It is an unusual situation, and I think, to be fair, we've gone through this process, and I stepped back from it. I just assumed it would be a routine admin job, in a way that Parliament and the parliamentary parties would tackle the problem. Except in this particular case, Waitemata and Gulf is the central city, what used to be called the CBD. Now we call it the city centre, because it's not just the CBD, the central business district of Auckland and indeed New Zealand, but it's an important residential area as well, and that is due to deliberate council policies. But also, we have to concede the market as well. The council, in effect, has facilitated the market demand for inner city living, and that's something that happens all around the world. And due to government and council policies, this area will continue to grow significantly. And so, in terms of a stable, durable solution, we have not achieved it. Whatever we've achieved around the region, we have not achieved it for Waitemata and Gulf. I heard, thank you for the members that have acknowledged my belated input, but I've heard the principle of equality of vote, and I think all of us would support that principle. But in this case, we're actually working against an equality of vote, because we have focused on one part of the Local Electoral Act, which talks about fair representation, and in regard to fair representation, the Act assumes population is a logical way to measure representation. And I guess around the country and around Auckland, 70% of the population are electors, or near enough to, and the rest are children and so on, people who are not eligible to vote, and that works and has worked, but not in this unusual situation, unusual for Auckland and unusual for the country, where only 51% of the population are eligible to vote. Now, I heard Member Northey talk about a low turnout in this ward. I know he's relatively new to this ward. However, this ward has one of the highest turnouts, parts of this ward, higher turnouts than anywhere, and even in the country. I'm talking about mainly the Gulf, but the city division also has high voter participation. That's not to be confused, because there's only 51% of the population eligible to vote. That should not be talked as a low turnout. It's a very high turnout in this particular ward. It's a very high profile, politically active ward. So in terms of equality of vote, by taking away the high voting areas of Parnell and Grafton, you are actually lowering, you are actually causing more unfairness or more inequality of voting compared to the rest of the region. In focusing on population only, mechanically, and not looking at the next part of the Act, section 19V3, where it says, however, what it says, you should plus or minus 10% with with the other voting areas, the other wards or divisions in your council is something you should be seeking. That's fair enough. But in focusing on that, I'm just amazed that the following section that says, however, if doing that divides a community of interest, then you don't have to. Then you don't have to. Now, the Local Electoral Act 2001 did not dream about the existence of a super city and the huge population increase in Waitemata section of the Waitemata Gulf Ward, but there was an out for the council to say, okay, let's ring fence this particular area. If we want equality of vote, and I support that principle, let's keep the status quo. We have already only half the population able to vote, which is lower. There are a lower number of voters in this ward now, before you take away the high voting areas, than there is in Ōrākei where those high voting areas are going. So that's, sorry, you're actually causing more voting inequality. So I ask the council to think again on this one. If we want a durable, stable solution that's not going to have a knock-on effect and destabilise Ōrākei and Albert Eden and Fo and so on, Maunga Kia, Tamaki and so on, every 6 years, put a ring fence around this particular special area, because it is special, because we've made it special with our policies, and acknowledge the fact that there are only 51% of the population eligible to vote, and because of these reforms, or proposed reforms, because they have to get past the Local Government Commission who created this system, I ask the council to look again and look at a more durable, robust solution. In terms of the people who are not represented who live in my ward, I noticed that one of the hearing sessions, one of the local board members of the hearing panel raised them as if to say they've got human rights. They may not be eligible to vote in Auckland, and they're obviously eligible to vote in Hamilton or Christchurch or Beijing or London or Los Angeles, where these international people come from.
Councillor, can you please wind up? You've had the 5 minutes
Okay.
plus the automatic 2 minutes extension.
Okay, I'll wrap up now. But when, I can tell you this as a local councillor, though, I'm not, this is a representation review, so I don't represent them legally in any way. However, when some residents in my ward were beaten up, assaulted badly in Albert Park, and they were international students, it was me that called for a public meeting with the Auckland Chinese University Students Association. I think candidate Phil Goff attended, the police attended, and we got some action. I don't represent them, but I still speak out for people, anybody in my ward.
Thank you, Councillor. The time has expired now. Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Your Worship. Firstly, acknowledging the Working Party around all the recommendations that have been put in here. So I just want to acknowledge the Working Party. But I also will say this, is that the process earlier on just needs tweaking, and that's been taken on board, and I understand that. Your Worship, I'm only going to speak very briefly on the Manukau ward, the split. And I want to acknowledge the two local boards, Otara Papatoetoe and also Mangere Otahu, in regards to their recommendation. But also, I just wanted to point out, and we've all were here when there was some deputation done early on, Your Worship, and I just wanted to mention the recommendation from the Otara Papatoetoe local board meeting dated the 17th of July. And it's A, and it was moved by Member Gush and seconded by Member Trenberth, which is really recommend to the governing body that the issue of representation of the Manukau ward requires further consideration and public consultation. We've done that, and I mean that's all we've been waiting for, is the consultation. We've done it. We've got the papers in front of us.
We've heard the numbers, 80%, 77, and I will be supporting the fact that the ward is not split. I will be supporting, I went right through the whole process around ensuring that the public had the ability to consult, and they have. So I applaud the communities in both the local boards, and the figures are there. You know, in Māngere o Tāihu, 256, and in Otara Papatoetoe, 297. But it was overwhelmingly, they said that the ward stays together, and that's exactly what I will be voting for. Your Worship, I was going to mention an email that was sent out to everybody around central government and the fact that the central government reference, there should be a position, you know, made from central government around the policy. But, you know, central government in regards to this this is a local government issue. Central government have put the act in regards to this, but I will tell the member that sent that email out what the policy position for the central government is, just to let them know. But overwhelmingly, I will be supporting the recommendations and the fact that the Manukau ward does not get split. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Last speaker is Councillor Desley Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, I wasn't going to speak, but I am. I'm going to advise my colleagues that I'm not going to vote on Roman numerals 1 to 8 because it affects me and I'm going to stand again. But I will, my comments will be around, because it's not about me, it's about the process and what's happened. I, having listened to Chairman Northey and the team that have worked with him and the other members of the political party, believe that our process shows and our recommendations in front of us show that we have listened to the people. I was interested in Councillor Lee's question about how many people, you know, didn't like the changes that were proposed. But the answer, of course, was the dislike wasn't on all of the change. It was actually about splitting a community of interest. So the decision I'm asking the rest of the councillors to make is, do you believe in communities of interest should stay together? And if you do, you'll support the recommendations. Do you believe in listening to the feedback and voting upon that? If you do, you'll vote on the recommendations. The only other comment I will make is that I'm not going to vote on Roman numeral 16, and that's only because we haven't consulted on it. And I kind of find that this is all based around consultation, and we left that bit off. So I just feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm not saying it's right, but we haven't consulted on it, so I won't be voting for that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. I've had a late call from Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to make the comment. I sit in agreement with the local boards from Otara Papatoetoe and Māngere o Tāihu. The only comment I wanted to make was, granted the feedback has been resounding from the folk who submitted from the ward of Manukau, was the learnings that we can take as a council, as an organisation, around how this is probably one of the highest levels of engagement we've seen from the folk out in Manukau. We know that from voter data, it's very clear if you are brown, young, unhoused, renting, if you're lucky, living in state housing, you tend not to participate in official kind of state sanctioned or council advanced voter participation. And so I just wanted to congratulate the local boards who are here, because I think the Facebook, the online social media campaigns that they put out were really highly engaged within the community, and I think the local boards have opened the way. Whilst you know, both of them were keen on getting more engagement from people, I don't think they came back considerably demonstrating a position. What it shows is that we are able to engage, and this was a fantastic outcome. So I want to acknowledge the local boards, the members who are here. I know that Chair Foley's watching online at the moment as well. I think key for our understanding as a council, because I've made the comment on numerous occasions about how we don't, or there's a lack of engagement from poorer communities, is that when you've got people going out with messages where other languages are being spoken, where people can stand up in front of others in churches and in community fora and speak Samoan or Tongan or Hindi or Mandarin in some instances, then people feel like they can engage. They're able to, it's the first language that they know, they're comfortable with it, they're comfortable with the cultures around that language. And I think what the local boards have shown is that there's an emerging leadership out in the areas where people feel like they're being listened to, they're being heard, they're being well represented. And so on that basis, I want to congratulate the campaign for engagement that was undertaken by the local boards who knew this was an issue that had a close impact for the people of Manuka and got out there. And I want to reiterate the words of Councillor Filipaina, who said that the community have spoken quite loudly on this one. It's resounding. It was good we got their feedback, but I think a lot of that goes down to the work that was done by local board members who can speak other languages and who were prepared to give up their own time. Granted that most of them are in part-time roles, give up their own time and get out into our churches and our communities. So I wanted to make that congratulatory note known. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and if I can just wind up with some brief comments. First of all, I want to acknowledge a process that I think was very fair, very positive, very professional, and thank you for all of those on the Working Party that made it such. I think Richard Northey mentioned that unlike in some parts of the world where these processes are about people trying to gerrymander results to suit their own purposes, there was no element of that. And I congratulate the participants for producing a process that I think our wider electorate can have confidence in. The clearly most controversial issue is the issue of Waitemata and the change of boundaries. Having represented areas that have gone through radical changes in boundaries, including the disappearance of my electorate on one occasion, I can absolutely identify with councillors who are concerned to see their community of interest divided up. But community of interest is a critical element in determining boundaries. But I think the fundamental principle of our democracy is one person, one vote, and that effectively means one vote, one value. And my belief is that if we take to the Local Government Commission a non-complying decision that has one part of the electorate 44% over quota, that will not survive their scrutiny. They will make the decision, not us, and I would prefer that Auckland made the decision about itself in a way that still doesn't comply. Waitemata is still 18% over quota, but there is at least an argument that we can put forward that may be persuasive to the Local Government Commission. Ōrākei is equally 15% over, but again I think that is defensible and there is room for a non-complying decision to be accepted if the circumstances are exceptional. But having a ward that is 44% over simply won't pass the cut of the Local Government Commission, in my opinion. So my support will go in favour of the recommendation of the Joint Working Party, Governance Working Party. On Manukau, I listened to the debate originally and to the submissions of the local boards, which were very eloquently made. My view at that point was they may be right. I didn't challenge the nature of the submissions they made, but why don't we give the local people the chance to make that decision? And I congratulate the local board in doing that in an effective way that had over 800 submissions made. They, in my view, have made the decision and we should respect that decision. On the question of Puki Tā Papa, I think, look, my view is if in normal circumstances, if you can have one community of interest, but it's manageable for the local ward councillor, that's a good thing. But we haven't consulted on that, and I don't think we can put that to the Local Government Commission. On the change of name, I don't see that as hugely consequential because the local board is already called Puki Tā Papa. Everybody knows what it is, and I think there would be wide acceptance of that. Would it have been better to have had the change of name go out for a consultation process? Yes, it would have, but I don't think it's such that that should stand in our way. We come now to the vote, and if there is a request for division on any sector, I'm of course happy to and obliged to accept that. But I thought if we vote in blocks, and the first block would be A to D, which is receiving the report, the submissions, noting the feedback, and receiving the minutes, and then take it ward by ward, and then separately for the renaming and recommendation F and G. So I'll proceed in that way unless there's any objection. So I'll put to the governing body recommendations A to D. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. We now will take the block E1 to E8. Is there any request for a division on this? We'll do it on voices.
I'll abstain, please.
Okay. So I will put E1 to 8 as set out. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. To the contrary, no.
No.
I
Please
declare
record
it carried.
my name against.
Record your name against. Is there any other person want to be recorded against that? Councillor
Abstain.
Watson,
And I'm an abstention, please.
and an abstention from Councillor Simpson, if we can note that. Recommendation E9 on the Manukau ward. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. Recommendation 10 and 11 on the Rodney Local Board subdivision boundaries. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. Recommendations 12, 13 and 14, retaining existing boundaries in Rodney, Manurewa, Papakura and Howick. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. I'll take the renaming motions separately. Recommendation E15, Great Barrier to Aotea Great Barrier. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. Recommendation 16, Albert Eden Roskill to Albert Eden Puki to Papa. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 To the contrary, no.
No.
I declare that carried. Would you like your... No. Okay. Recommendation F, which delegates to me the role of identifying representatives. It seems to me that the chair and the vice chair would be the obvious person, but I'm happy to add another councillor or councillor to that. Maybe I'll take that under advice later. I'll put that recommendation. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. And finally, recommendation G. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 To the contrary, no. Carried. And thank you very much, and thank you to the local board members who have participated in the process today.
Your Worship, you'll ensure that that there is recorded that I took no part in the debate and that I took no part in voting on that matter because of what I believe is a conflict.
Yep. Thank you,
But
Councillor.
now
Will.
that the debate is concluded, I was hopeful that there could be the inclusion of other councillors in terms of any representation, and Councillor Newman is one that I would hope.
Yeah, I had Councillor Newman in mind as a third councillor, if that's the appropriate number to go through because of his active participation. We will record your non-participation in the debate and the vote
I'd
accordingly.
probably like to go down and tell them what I think in terms of whether or not we should be dealing with this as well. But
Thank you,
I can
Councillor.
write to them.
I think we'll leave you off that representation.
I think we'll take just a 5-minute break now before we move on to item number 9, which is on contributions policy. ask councillors to be seated, please, and we'll get underway on item number 9. And while councillors are getting seated, if I can call to the table Ross Tucker, Andrew Duncan and Bobby Parkinson, I think are the 3 officials, and we have more officers in the back of the room if we need them. Ross, are you going to be accompanied there, or?
Yep, and Andrew will join me, and we might bring up other people as we need to.
Right. Okay. Item number 9 was the subject, of course, of a workshop. Trying to remember, was it this week or last week?
This week.
One week becomes the next. So we've got some background on that, and I think our officers have taken on board some of the comments that were made in the workshop and will report back to us on that today. What we're agreeing to do today, if we pass the recommendations, is to go out to consultation, in particular with the development community, on the changes in policy. And I think there's been a change in the time frame so that we'll have the chance for some of the stakeholders to make representations a week later than was originally proposed on the 20th of November, I think. Another issue that came up was a question around the manner in which the $730 million that we've voted in the long-term plan, the 10-year budget for parks acquisition, how that is divided up between local parks, sports grounds and regional reserves. And I think that's a really interesting question. I think we need to give some time to that. Yep. But what I would suggest with to officers that we actually have a separate workshop on that question, which is separate from the question of what we're discussing today, which is development contributions. I think it is important that we understand how the funding, it's a huge amount of funding, $730 million, we're acquiring new public open space. How do we allocate that between the competing areas for it? So suggest to officers that we don't take time up today because it's a side issue to what we're focused on, but that we do come back and have a workshop on that particular topic. I'll just make a note of the fact that in our 10-year budget, of course, for parks and community investment, we increased that by over 50% from $2.4 billion to $3.7 billion. Yep. So we have made a huge commitment of additional funds in this area. So it's not a case of continually adding to the amount of funds we've got, but how we best spend that money for the public good. Ross, I think you're going to lead off on discussion, but before you do that, maybe if I move pro forma the recommendations, seconded by the Deputy Mayor Cashmore, and Ross, if you lead off, and then we'll go through questions and comments on the paper.
Okay, thank you. I'll just give a bit of background around the contributions policy and the decision that we're seeking today, which is about agreement to consult on a draft policy. And then I'll hand over to Andrew Duncan to just touch on some of those issues that arose from that workshop earlier this week. So firstly, development contributions are a key part of how we fund our recently agreed 10-year budget. So that 10-year budget, as you recall, includes $26 billion of investment over the next 10 years. And as the Mayor's indicated, it includes significant additional investment in the parks and community area, also significant investment in the transport area. Because our current contributions policy expires at the end of January next year, we need to go out and consult and then agree and put in place a new contributions policy by early next year at the latest, in order to get the revenue that we need so that we can give effect to our long-term plan and crack on with building all of that infrastructure that's planned in there. We also need to work within the constraints of legislation, and in terms of the contributions legislation, that means in particular we have to have a very clear evidential link of the basis of the link between the infrastructure that we are charging for and then how the demand arises from different types of developments and different locations. So the law is very clear. If we don't have good evidential-based decision-making around those linkages, then that reduces our ability to charge contributions. So today we're specifically asking for your approval to go out and consult on a draft policy. We want to go out and have a good conversation with the development community. We see that as a continuation of a discussion we've been having with the development community in Auckland for many years. It's been a good two-way communication exercise. This time we have got an extensive program with lots of feedback and engagement events across the region. And we are very keen to hear what the development community has to say. We're very keen that they understand what we're trying to do and that they have an opportunity to input into the policy to make sure it's as fair as possible. As an example of that, at the last consultation exercise we had, the feedback was it was too rushed. There wasn't enough information coming forward to support it. So this time we have taken more time. We have 4 weeks of consultation, and this consultation is going to be supported by a much richer set of collateral, quite detailed CapEx schedules and other information about how the contributions policy works. So that's us responding to previous feedback, and we're very keen to hear what the development community has to say this time around. So I'll pass over to Andrew to talk about some of those issues that were raised earlier this week.
Thank you, Ross. Andrew.
So you had a few questions of us and raised a few issues at the workshop we held earlier this week. In regards to open space investment, you were looking at how that interacted with our contributions policy. So the investment decisions for the council in parks, driven by the Auckland Plan, development strategy, our open space provision policy, made on a prioritised basis within the budgets that's set in the long-term plan. And the DC policy provides a mechanism to recover some of the cost of that with development contributions. It covers the growth part of the cost. As the Mayor said, our investments in parks and communities increased substantially in this 10-year budget. We've got Ian and Paul to talk to you shortly about perhaps having a workshop, as the Mayor suggested, to look at these investment decisions and the questions you had about them, how they've been implemented in response to the Council's other policies, development strategy, open space provision policy. Just repeating, the development contributions are recovering the cost of that, and so if you make any changes to the investment plans, then we can adjust our contributions policy following that to reflect those decisions. The policy is our cost recovery mechanism that follows through on your investment decisions. That's something that it's a live policy, and we can update that over time as the investment decisions change. You also had some questions about our changes to, or proposed changes to transport demand factors, and in particular, we've reviewed our trip generation statistics, and that's given us the view that we should be making some adjustments to transport demand factors. So it looks like from this information, retail and commercial development should pay more, and other development types, including residential, should pay a bit less. We've included, we're going to amend the how we set DC's document that will go out for consultation to include the list of the 5 data sources we use for trip generation data, so that anyone looking at these documents, they can see that material. There's website links there, and you can see what the trip generation data is telling us at quite a detailed level for those who are interested. And that'll be of help to the community, and particular developers, when they're looking at the proposal. They can see the basis upon which we did that work. We'll be able to get their feedback and consider their views. And you'll be able to consider those too when you make your decisions in December. Also, if you wish, we've got one of our colleagues here from Transport to talk about some of that trip generation data if you wish. In addition, we've made, finally, in response to other questions at the meeting, we've provided a bit more time from between when submissions close and when the community will have an opportunity to present directly to councillors. So you asked to have some time to be able to look at the submissions before you heard the presentation from those providing feedback. So we've rescheduled the proposed date of the 16th of Friday the 16th of November to Friday the 23rd of November for that to take place.
Ian.
Your Worship. Look, just further to the comments from Your Worship, where we can come back to councillors and have a workshop with respect to the priorities, the mechanisms, the way of funding parks right across the city. It's a complicated business, and it's one which I think needs to be undertaken in a fulsome manner, as some of the decisions are likely to be tested later, perhaps in courts, as we try to implement them. So perhaps rather than try and go through it now, I think certainly the Mayor's concept of having a separate workshop to look at those issues is very important. But we can run through how decisions are made with respect to local parks, the level of priorities, how it relates to growth, regional parks. I know that was an issue raised at the discussion in the earlier workshop as to how they are funded and some possibilities how they could be funded in the future. But we're certainly able to come back to you around a workshop on those issues.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Ian. If there's no further comment from the end of the table, we'll just move into questions. I've got an extensive list already that's growing by the minute. So we'll start off with Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Just on the development contributions for stormwater, when we have infill housing in, say, the brownfields areas, the development contribution is taken, but for what I can see, especially out my way at the moment, we've got a lot of flooding and stormwater issues. I can't see the money that's been collected in those areas being put back into the stormwater to so somebody might do an infill housing or whatever, and they might put in their own stormwater for the catchment, and everybody keeps on saying, well, it's wonderful, we're upgrading, well, we've had all of this done, but all the other houses surrounding it are not actually connected into the stormwater catchment, and we're having all this flooding. So what I would like to see is that the money that's been collected from development contributions and the part of it that is for stormwater is used in that particular area, and the houses that are surrounding the development that's just gone in, there's some connections, because in my area we've got people still not living in their houses from the April weather event, and they haven't got insurance to cover any further extreme weather events. So this is really a serious matter, so I'd like you to address that. Thank you.
Maybe we could use answering this question as a means of just spelling out what the legislation requires from the development contributions we charge, because there's a specificity about that. The money we take from a particular development needs to go into particular projects, and we need to abide by that legislative requirement, or our development contribution charges will be overturned.
So this is also some more specificity of the kind that you're also asking for, Councillor, was asked of us by developers in May, meets with our legislative requirements to be as specific as we can about how the money is going to be used. So we've increased substantially the level of detail that backs up the proposed policy, and there's a page, what page number, Ross? There's quite an extent, there's a very detailed list in the document and in the papers that you have today. I'll try and find the page number for you. It includes the stormwater projects by area, and we've got quite a large number of smaller catchment areas for stormwater, so you can see what is proposed in those areas and where the development contributions charges are going. But I'll ask Mark from our Healthy Waters team to respond in a bit more detail to your question.
Thank you. The flooding that we're currently experiencing around Auckland, and particularly in the eastern suburbs, is a factor of the existing housing plus the new growth. So we do have a number of projects we have identified in the area to manage that flooding. Part will be funded by development contributions, but some will also be general rates in terms of flood response. because that flooding is linked to the existing housing plus the new housing. So we do have a number of projects we are looking at. Catchment areas, as Andrew was saying, we have about 15 catchments that we use for different development contributions, and therefore there's 15 different price factors depending on the issues within that catchment related to growth.
I'd just like to, for you to take back to Healthy Waters that I really, really appreciate all the work that they're doing out there at the moment. They have actually really gone above and beyond. Thank you.
So the specific list of stormwater projects to be funded by DCs is at page 211 of your agenda, and the catchment maps for stormwater are on page 243.
243. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Richard Hills.
Yes, I talked about, thank you, Chair. I spoke about this the other day at the workshop, and I'm not sure if it's a question for the finance team or transport, but I am really concerned about how we measure the retail versus production travel movements. Like, it's a pretty hefty increase for retail, and the example even given here on, say, a mall, I'm just concerned how that is apportioned when maybe a car trip or a walking trip or a cycle trip or a bus trip to that area, how it's spread across, say, one person going to 5 stores. Is that included for each store, or the one building, or the one town centre? And the other issue is the waiting. So people going to a production, like a quarry or I don't know what, but they're obviously going to be using heavier vehicles that may have more wear and tear on the roading than maybe a retired person driving to a store or something once a week. So I just want to know how it actually measures the use, and if it's just an arbitrary humans going to a site.
So in looking at the trip generation data, we've set out a little in our report to you, and also in a bit more detail in how we set DCs, which accompanies the consultation document, some of the factors that we considered. So we looked at the raw trip generation data, but we also then made some adjustments to reflect the fact that people will often go from one place to another, stopping somewhere along the way.
Yep.
The trip generation data does include things like shopping malls. So all of this is weighted in there. There's access to that information going to be provided in our document for those to have a look at it, and particularly developers. And we do recognise that it's quite a major increase, although it is very similar to what our neighbouring cities do. I'll have John Davies from the Auckland Forecasting Centre, who's got a good grasp of how trip generation data works, and he may be able to add something to what I've said.
What Andrew said is essentially the process that's followed. There are factors in the trip generation rates that do allow for what we call multi-purpose trips, which tend to be reduction factors, because you don't really want to double count the entire trip as independent trips if they are multi-use trips or multi-leg trips. So those factors are built into the process. I can't offhand verify what the factors are and what they should be, but I think it's important to note that they are there, and they do attempt to apportion trips in a more fair and equitable way between the different beneficiaries of activities that require trip making. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question.
I guess, and I know I'm using anecdotal examples, but you know, say a truck goes to a production or distribution place, and they're going to probably travel further with a heavier vehicle, and you know, then say someone driving from their home to a mall in a car. And are you including trip generation? Does that include walking, cycling, public transport, or are you only including vehicle crossings of that from the road to the unit?
Historically, the trip generation rates refer to vehicle trips, and that would include generally all types of vehicles, including heavy axle vehicles. On the topic of heavy vehicles, I guess those do get taxed and pay contributions in other avenues. So that would form part of the greater pool. But in this case, I don't think there's much differentiation on particular land uses. That can be accommodated in the actual rates that are levied by a particular land use if it's deemed to be heavily weighted towards heavy trucks, for example. So there are other mechanisms where you can adjust the rates charged if it's deemed appropriate to that particular activity. I think one of the issues with the trip generation rates is that we do tend to work on averages. Averages have their problems, but they also have a lot of advantages. But you're never going to match every precise activity at any particular time precisely.
So, but yeah, maybe I'm not reading it right, but so say Queen Street, someone opens or builds a new retail store on Queen Street or somewhere like that, or that basically they might not have a vehicle crossing, so it's very hard to even show that you're getting vehicle trip generators. They're still going to pay $18,000 per 100 square metres.
So that example was included so that it will be quite clear the sort of order of magnitude we're talking about. But the actual charge would vary depending on the part of the city and the investment required in that area. But by putting that example in, I wanted to make it quite abundantly clear that it was a big change that we're proposing to consult on to get feedback. Actual weight is an important factor in considering transport investment and the nature of the roads, but congestion is as well. And one truck might be a lot heavier on the road, but it doesn't take up as much space as multiple numbers of cars. So they've got that balance as well. And trip generation is used at a strategic level, just advised. It's an important aspect in that context. I'd also note that the raw averages between retail and domestic is about 13 to 1, whereas the charging ratio is 2.8 to 1. So there's quite a bit of raw adjustment being made already. But it'll be good to get the community and development community's views back on these proposals as well.
It just feels wrong, but I guess
I think, just to be clear, trip generation is about volume. It's not about weight. Weight's dealt with through road user charges. That depends on axle limits, etc. Is that correct?
That is definitely one element, Mr. Mayor. I mean, the other element is also that the cost of building, for example, a heavier road would also depend on the area and the use of that road. So your cost would also vary from area to area, and that would then fall out of how you needed to portion your infrastructure costs in general areas. So if it's a commercial area with a lot of heavy trucks, the road pavements would be stronger and would cost more, and that would be a more area-based cost, which could presumably be taken up by different factors by area.
Yeah. I think for most of us this is pretty complex and technical stuff, but obviously we're going to benefit from the feedback we get on the proposal from those in the development community, and we'll fine-tune it accordingly. If we're demonstrated to be wrong on something, we've got an open mind, we'll make the adjustments accordingly. So I'm not sure that we're going to get something that we fully comprehend. I certainly don't, but the process should help us get to the right point, I'm hoping. Thank you. Is Councillor Wayne Walker?
Yeah. I think my first question goes to the Mayor's comment that he doesn't fully comprehend what we've got here, and I'd suggest most of us don't, and I'd suggest that the development community may to a certain extent, but as far as the general public is concerned, I consider it incredibly difficult they're making a submission on this. So I've got a question, and that is, how can we make it easier for the general public to understand what we're going out with here? And I guess I'd preface that with the question, how significant are development contributions in terms of our budget relative to, let's say, greenfields development? And I think there's a self-evident answer around that, but I'll leave that to you. And then brownfield. So how important are these numbers?
It is. So development contributions are, one of the ways we pay for growth infrastructure. It is a big number. It's multiple billions of dollars. So it is significant investment, significant funding source that funds significant investment. So it is important part of how council manages its finances. In terms of making this clear to the community, we've worked pretty hard to try to come up with consultation documents and materials that explain the issues at a high level, using diagrams and maps where we can. Is when you get into the details of how trip generation works, it is the nature of how you charge at that detail level is complicated. There is not a lot we can do to make the complex really simple, but we have tried to put what are the key issues into our consultation document, have one page that explains what is happening with overall charging levels, what is happening with demand factors, and try to make that as simple as possible. And so start on page 266, you'll see sort of the one-page explanation, and then layered in behind that is a methodology document. Layered in behind that is 5 detailed technical reports on transport trips. So it's kind of, we see it as a hierarchy of different layers of detailed information.
So if somebody in the community, say somebody on the Hibiscus Coast or on the North Shore or the like, wants to get a handle on how this affects them into the future, bearing in mind this is 10 years, is there any way that we can express a quantity of reserves or a particular improvement around community facilities that we could express pictorially as it goes to an area of land, for example?
So yes, so based on your feedback from the workshop earlier this week, Councillor, we did have a look at how is there a way to simply explain in terms of this policy how many hectares of land or how many kilometres of road we get. That all gets very complicated very quickly, and in the time available we weren't able to come up with any kind of soundbite facts and figures that we could safely use and ensure that they're evidentially based. So I think it's a good concept to try to turn the complex financial piece into what does it mean in terms of on-the-ground infrastructure on average across the region. But I think we'd need to take a bit more time to work through that to deliver that.
Would it be possible to even give a very small number of examples so that somebody can see how the policy translates into something real for, let's say, a given area? So people can comprehend it.
Yeah. So in the consultation document, we've tried to include some maps and some key areas. So in the north, how do the contributions work? How does that fit in with the broad infrastructure planning? So starting on page 262, you'll see some maps of different, how does contributions work in some areas. It doesn't go down into the detail of particular numbers and average charges because the charges do vary by type of development. But we've tried to put some maps and pictures that try to explain in simple terms what is the essence of what we're trying to achieve here.
Do we do any work, any focus group work with something like this where we take some people out there in the community and we put this to them and we ask them whether they can understand it or not? Just as a matter of interest, given that this is so significant?
We haven't looked at focus groups for this exercise. We kind of see that the Have You Say events is where we are taking this out to the community, and they will make these documents available. We will invite feedback and if they give us feedback on how we present as well as the content, then we're happy to accept that and improve over time.
Okay, just got a question around parks, and I've looked through the list of parks acquisition. Is there anything in there in the list of park acquisitions that's for a regional park or not?
No, so there's nothing specifically in there to acquire new regional parks. There are, I guess we need to be careful about definitions. We have regional budgets that are held regionally versus ones that are held locally. So we have a significant investment that is at a regional level, but it is looking, the investment, the response to growth is about investing in sports parks, other parks across the
I
region.
understand that.
And Ian can give more detail.
My simple question is there any regional park acquisition? I mean,
No, at the moment there isn't, and that is something that can be discussed at this workshop that we've talked about.
do you think that's a useful piece of information to communicate to people so they know? I mean, if we assume that regional parks are important to people, and historically we've had a program of acquiring regional parks, but we're not doing that now, is that something we should be communicating in a few words?
Perhaps if I can explain. So the regional parks are funded out of rates primarily, although we also have had additions by gifts, investments by owners and developers. So over the last few years there have been decisions made by council to invest ratepayer funding as opposed to development contributions, and also lands that have been vested. Regional parklands are one of those items which I think it'd be worthwhile talking through at the workshop. So there is a strong view around regional parks being purchased for things such as landscapes, the environment, conservation, and also for human recreation. But it's not purely related to growth, and this is where development contributions come in. So that's the sort of thing I think we could talk about as to what role might development contributions play with regional parks. But as of today, it's ratepayer funding for grants.
So if we pick up on that, should we then be communicating that we do not have any proposals for any ratepayer funding for regional parks? Because my understanding is that that is the case.
The purpose of this consultation is to explain, well, what is it that the development contributions are doing, what does it pay for? There's any range of things that development contributions are not paying for. So the focus here is, well, we're consulting on an increase in development contribution charges and a new policy, so we need to be, so the law requires us to go and explain what is it that DCs are paying for.
Can I maybe just seek a little bit of clarification following on from Councillor Walker's questions? My understanding from our workshop is that it's much easier to allocate the cost of a local reserve to a development contribution, because the growth requires that, than it is to allocate a development contribution to a regional park, so that regional parks are largely funded out of alternative rates funding rather than development contributions. Is my assumption correct?
Yes. That's correct. The law requires that we must show that link between growth and the demand for regional parks.
So,
and perhaps Ian could comment
yeah.
on that.
Can I just clarify another point too, arising out of Councillor Walker's questions? I mean, for the wider public, the broader picture needs to be painted. Why are we going for more development contributions? Because we have major growth, and that growth is putting pressure on our resources. What's the ballpark figure of the difference in revenue that the new proposed policy for development contributions will bring to council? What does it go from and to?
So the current plan and the DC policy is recovering 2.2 million over 10 years, and the proposal, in line with the investment decisions you've made on the long-term plan, would see us recover 2.7 million over the coming 10 years.
Billion?
A billion, sorry,
Billion.
yes.
Yeah, sorry. I was
talking about
I was thinking that, what are we sitting here for? Yeah, okay, so it goes from 2.2 to
2.7.
2.7. You're talking about $500 million.
Correct.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much. You finished, Councillor?
So just further to the issue that the Mayor raised around the link, do we have some research on the link between the increase in population and the increased requirement for regional parks?
So the link is loose. So we know that over the last few years, the 6 million visitors each year, growing at about 20%. So there's that sort of link with the overall population. But to be able to say we have purchased additional regional parkland purely to provide for that, as opposed to landscape protection, environment, habitat, it's more difficult. And I think that's the sort of issue we can discuss. And needs to be undertaken in a way which can subsequently be justified, I suspect, before the courts if a change is made around funding. But we do have data.
So if we do some work in this area and we do find that we need more biodiversity across the region, that we need more regional parks for a whole range of reasons, climate change and the like, how quickly can we change our contributions regime to reflect that, if we do that work?
Quite quickly. So we would have an obligation to consult, but it's not an annual, not a set time each year we have to do it, and we have made changes to the policy in response to other factors in relatively short spaces of time, following an appropriate consultation, of course.
So I'll just put up my hand and say, quite quickly sounds good to me, let's get on with it.
Thank you very much. Councillor Fletcher.
I had another question.
Well, okay, quickly please.
And that is, I understand development contributions, which are effectively collecting revenue to fund things for extra growth across stormwater and transport and the like. Do we have any incentives for people on their properties to deal with their transport, their stormwater, their water, their sewage issues, so that they're not impacting on the bigger picture? So the person that wants to deal with their own sewage, that wants to deal with their own water, that doesn't want to have a car, that wants to do something or the like, are there any incentives for that?
It's a bit wide
Certainly
of what we're looking at today, but have a go.
Yeah. In the context of the development contributions policy, if not for transport or water and wastewater, which is a water care issue, but in relation to stormwater, if you manage your stormwater yourself and it flows to sea, for example, then we don't charge.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. I really welcome this piece of work, and before I put my question to you, I've enjoyed being part of a number of workshops over a few years now that is seeing a lot of this coming to fruition, and working from that principle of growth must pay for growth has been really satisfying to see it come together. And I've been quite excited about some of the methodologies that you've put forward, you know, in terms of units of demand for activities and things, trying to get a much more sophisticated regime. I am, in asking my question, I am not in any way putting pressure on officers, because I believe the concern, and I want to explore this issue of regional parks. Well, I welcome the willingness of the Mayor to say that we can have a workshop on this. I think that when you're putting an item out for consultation, there has to be transparency about issues that might occur in the future. And from my perspective, the issue of regional parks has been known to members of the governing body. It was discussed at the adoption of the LTP. I mean, we asked some of us questions at the time and discovered the answer, which is it's approximately only in the 10-year period, 450 odd, I can't remember the exact amount, but less than half the cost of the average house in Auckland over a 10-year period. Now you might say, well, all that other money is going to parks and that's fabulous. The reality is there are going to be, there are differences, and I want Ian to reflect on what the differences are on regional parks to destinational parks and small reserves and so forth. I believe that with the growth that we're experiencing, there is methodology around the regional parks being those destinations and the use of those regional parks. And I think that we shouldn't close our mind just because it's hard to actually trying to quantify some of those values, particularly in light of the fact that some of our regional parks, because of Karo dieback, will be closing, and that we know that is an expectation of the people of Auckland region, that we do continue to provide regional parks. So Ian, while I welcome the workshop, I do think there should be some visibility about the potential for funds to be available for the future. The last regional park, as we discussed at the workshop, was Fernglen, of which Auckland Council only funded a third, because we had the ability to have some seeding funds, and that was actually part of a partnership where we brought people together. Now, the whole idea of...
Sorry, Councillor, can I just get you to come to the question, because we're in the question
I'm coming
session
to the question.
still?
If you go through all of the projects that are listed from page 211 right through into the end of that agenda report, there is not one specific regional park reference. Now, the law requires, around development contributions, that there is specificity. It's something that I welcome, because I think it gives the kind of accountability and transparency that the public expect from us. So I want you, because we've had workshops on this in the past, I want you to differentiate between regional parks and the general parks, and I want you to talk about what we have discussed in terms of possibility of weaving these into the future, because I would like to see some funds being available that we can take opportunities and create partnerships into the future. So I'm asking you to respond to that, Ian, please.
So look, in very short terms, our local parks, so these are the things at the bottom of your street or within your neighbourhood, are designed to service a catchment, and we often talk about sort of a walking distance into that catchment or an easy drive. It's not quite as easy as that, because some parks have specialist facilities, and we can only provide a number of those across the region, so people do travel, examples being playgrounds. But there is a very clear link to additional people and additional utilisation, and we were able to show that to developers and others. Regional parks are a little different. We obtain or purchase those for a variety of reasons, one of which is certainly recreation. They draw their people from a much wider area, although a good majority still come from a local area, but they can come from right across our region. But we also purchase them and operate them for a range of reasons other than recreation. So these are environmental reasons, habitat reasons, landscapes, particularly important landscapes across our region. So it's that link, particularly to the environment, to the landscapes, etc., that is more difficult to actually link back to development contributions, and that's been the issue. We do have data that shows recreation utilisation is rising, and it's that sort of information that we think, particularly if we go through it in a workshop and we're able to do it in a fulsome way, that we may be able to look at making the link between development and contributions to utilisations within our regional parks.
The point that I want to get, and if we are to have a workshop, and I'm very pleased you're offering it, but there must be some visibility on this, because when the offer of regional parks has been put forward to this governing body over the last 8 years, population growth has always been a factor that has been included. So there seems to be an inconsistency now that and it's not at officers. I think officers are being asked to defend the indefensible. We have been remiss in not ensuring at the time of the LTP there were some funds that could be included in those pages that I've referred to, and there's nothing there. It is possible for these measurements to come into play, but I would be very disappointed if we go up to consultation and then at some future point we realise, we should have done that, but we didn't do it in the consultation and therefore we can't do it now, and it's just going to put more of a ratepayer burden in a way that I believe it shouldn't be a ratepayer burden. I believe that, we've been told by officers in the past when we've made these acquisitions, it's because the pressure on the parks, because of the population growth. Would we have had another regional park since 2010 added to the list if the population had remained at 1 million people? Probably not. So I hope that we can have an intelligent workshop on this and a degree of openness on it, and know that when we come to adopt the budgets in the future, that we are actually interrogating this and ensuring that we have actually factored that in.
I think we will cover this under the workshop, but the advice we're getting today is that there is a limited ability to fund regional parks out of development contributions. The issue itself is an important issue that we need to come to terms with, I agree, but development contributions will only make a limited contribution to that, is the message I'm hearing time and
In black
again
and
from
white?
officials.
I'd like a legal opinion on that.
Yeah.
Yep, well, maybe that's something, Ian, you can come back to and include in the workshop. Councillor Cooper.
Mine is, notwithstanding all the questions we've had, is actually about, because this is about going out for consultation, I'm going to be very parochial. Western Springs Garden Hall is only 5k from the CBD, so I know it's got Western in the name of the building, but I've had complaints from people in the West before about consulting for the West at Western Springs Gardens. So I would really ask you if you would change that. You know, we've got a hall at Sunderland Hall, which is a council hall at Hobsonville, and that's where all the development's going on, is up there. You know, Coomew, Red Hills and Hobsonville. So that's my question to you. I just don't think it's acceptable to have Western consultation at Western Springs. Thank you.
I think if you could look at that one again, I went to the long-term plan, and that was a point made by almost everybody at the meeting. Why have you got it in town when you say this is consultation for the West?
Yeah, and that's an important point, and we said
Not the isthmus. Yeah.
that's an important point, and we were quite concerned when we designed the consultation that we were doing it in a way that reflected what would suit the community, and particularly the development community. So we wrote to all the developers asking them where they'd like to have the consultation, and based on the responses we got, we set them telling us where they wanted to meet with us. We set up events that anyone can come to, but certainly in response to the developers' feedback to us in Manukau, Takapuna and in central Auckland. I think it's located here, in response to their requests.
5k away from Western Springs.
Well, this is where they told us they wanted to meet, and so we responded to them. We set up something in Western Springs in the evening to provide an opportunity for members of the public in particular, and that's open to everyone, and that was a central venue, so central for everyone in the region who's not available during office hours to come to. So that wasn't designed as the Western event, bearing in mind the comments you made,
There isn't
Councillor.
a Western event then.
Okay.
Because the developers let us know where they wanted to meet.
Yep. Thank you. Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you. I share the concerns of members in regard to regional parks. However, I'm listening to Mr. Maxwell and taking it from him that it's not so easy to dedicate money from development contributions to regional parks. So I'm quite happy to accept that and draw a line under it. The key is not where the money comes from regional parks. The key thing is that there is money for regional parks from wherever bucket it comes from. We, in the last few years, the Super City, ironically, has been quite weak in terms of progressing regional parks in keeping with the growth and population of the region. And I guess a workshop about regional parks would be quite helpful. So I accept what everyone is saying, that there is a real concern that we get some money to continue to support and expand our regional park system, but at the same time it may be a hard ask to get it from development contributions. So okay, that's not the only place where we can get money from. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. We've kind of morphed from questions into comments, but are there any further comments before we take this to
Got
to
a
the
further
vote?
question. Well, I've got
Sorry?
Got a further question, Mr. Chair.
Further question? Councillor Walker?
And that is, given, I would suggest, the huge public interest in this, would it be possible for the officers to put together some form of green paper to look at the options going forward that Aucklanders might consider, over and above having a workshop? Because, as I say, this is something of huge public interest, and I would suggest there are many people out there concerned about the lack of investment going forward into regional parks, particularly given the context of the explosive population increase we've had in recent years. So is there another way of doing this, or an additional way of doing this? And I'd invite a comment from perhaps Matthew around that.
Well, Can I suggest this is exactly the topic that we need to look at in terms of our workshop on regional parks? We have collectively voted more than 50% more for community facilities and open spaces. If there is, and I think there is a proper debate to be had around whether we are fairly allocating that extra expenditure in the areas where it's most needed. But that will be, I think, at the heart of the workshop that we're holding. So I think if we can hold that over it and have that debate in the proper place.
So my question wasn't about a workshop. That's great. My question is around putting some information out there so that members of the public, particularly across Auckland that have an interest around this, can consider it.
Well, I think before we put out a paper, we've got to work out what councillors feel about it, and that's what the workshop is intended to do. So let's do it in the proper sequence. We've got comments now. Councillor...
Sorry, questions?
Questions, sorry, yeah.
Still on questions, because we've...
No, I've just moved to comments, but if you've got a question and I've overlooked you, please ask the question.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just in terms of the payment, and I'm referring to page 161, there's a change there to making the payment at, and I think that's for multi-unit developments, isn't it? Residential developments, at the point of application for code compliance certificate. Am I correct in that regard? So have we checked that with legal, that particular part with legal? Are there risks in that delay? Are we taking into account multi-unit developments that can take 2 and 3 years, and therefore the code compliance can be very late, but the city's infrastructure has been, it's in the process of being paid for by that time. So I'm just wondering whether there should be a limit on that it's code compliance certificate up to a maximum of 12 months after the issuance of the building consent. Have you considered those implications?
We have had all of the documentation checked and approved by our legal team, and it's also been externally reviewed as well. So we've had external legal advice. The payment timing, our view from our statistics is that on average it's about 12 months for code compliance certificate. The additional cost of that to us has been included in our financial forecast, so we've budgeted for that, and it's included in our cost recovery. It's a small proportion of the overall development. Minimum. Yeah. And they must pay within 2 years, so there is a cap.
Oh, there is the cap, okay.
Yeah, but 12 months is sort of the average the team was thinking about. We've costed it in, and we're quite confident in the security of our payment. We've written off 74,000 of DC debt over 700 million invoiced in the last 8 years.
Okay. Just another question, and I'm thinking of the affordability of housing. I note that there are no remissions or waivers for DCs provided here. Where would the council examine the possibility of providing relief to the payment of development contributions where so-called, and to be determined how this is defined, affordable housing is guaranteed in perpetuity by either tenure of rent or tenure of ownership? Where would the council examine that? In the DC policy, or is it outside the DC policy?
So it wouldn't be within the DC policy, because we can't then pass the infrastructure costs for those developments on to other developers, because legally we can only charge developers for their fair share of the growth costs. So the appropriate mechanism to consider that would be through a grants process, like the grant that you provided to the redevelopment of the city mission through the long-term plan process.
So that would infer that it would have to be funded out of the rate space.
Yes, and effectively, if we were to have a DC waiver, it would get funded out of the rate space as well anyway, because we couldn't charge it to developers.
So you can't redistribute, okay. Okay, thanks for that clarification. And just on the transport, and I appreciate the staff's review of this policy and hopefully landing costs where the benefits lie and where the demand is generated from. I've previously in the workshops I've raised the importance of, particularly in the greenfields areas, and for transport where there's some very hefty costs, you've got new categories there. But then I go to examine some of the projects, and I look at a project, now I need to find it, say like Penlink or Mill Road. Mill Road is a very long road, and it benefits a lot of different sort of sub-catchments along the way. And I'm just wondering why it, unlike, say, Lincoln Road is broken up into categories, Mill Road is just one continuous, I think it's a $500 million project. I'm just wondering why that cost doesn't sort of fall into smaller catchments.
Mark from Auckland Transport will respond to that.
Mr. Chairman, Mark Fleming from Auckland Transport. The Mill Road is in the DC policy. It's part of the south area, and so the entire Mill Road is part of that one single catchment, and the development share or the growth share of that project has been assigned to that one single catchment area. In terms of cutting it up, we are going through a process of just confirming the business case and updating the business case to work out which areas will be developed and the sequencing of that. But we only have a single growth percentage for the entire corridor which we're applying. So we haven't tried to cut it up either geographically or in terms of growth areas at all. We've just applied it to that single south catchment.
So if I'm undertaking a development at Mangere Bridge, I'm in the south catchment, and I will be contributing to Mill Road, which is a long way out of, navigation zone. That's correct?
Yes, that would be true for the entire south catchment, for instance, and it is quite a large catchment area that's been defined in the maps. So it goes from, say, the Hauraki area to the south and then to the west areas there.
And the same applies for Penlink, $200 million project. If I'm tucked down at the bottom of Northcote there, close to a ferry, and we know that people live there because of their commutes to the city, they're in the north catchment, so they are paying for Penlink.
That's correct. So the maps, the transport catchment maps are in the papers. There's probably a reference for them.
I've got that.
Yeah, so the catchment areas, and it's a sort of council choice about where the catchment areas lie, but they've been defined relatively large, and there's groups of infrastructure within the catchment which, while there might be a Penlink, there'll also be other projects in the north or in the south. While there might be a Mill Road, there'll be other projects throughout that area that all areas in the south, for instance, contribute to.
Okay.
Okay, councillors, if I can just remind you, we've got another major item on the agenda, plus we've got a workshop starting at 1 o'clock. I know it's been a long, hard week, but if we can just try to keep our comments and the comment session that we're going into now to the point and as brief as possible. So, Councillor Newman, you've got the first call.
Yeah, thank you. Your Worship, growth has to fund itself. It has to contribute to the delivery of infrastructure to offset the impact of growth. I think the Local Government Act requires, and actually the court has upheld this, it requires causation, but beyond causation there is an established principle, and this policy needs to reflect that not only do we have to address causation, but also the benefits received from the delivery of infrastructure provided. Infrastructure provided will benefit new residents. It will also benefit existing residents. And the court upheld that, and I wonder actually if the decision of the court in relation to the Neil Group versus North Shore City, because that's quite an old decision now, but it is still probably preeminent when it comes to the issue of how you deliver major transmission infrastructure that Councillor Darby was talking about to reflect both the requirement for developers to fund the causal nexus between growth and infrastructure, as well as the benefits to the community wider than just the new residents. So I want to say that in relation to the transmission infrastructure that has been named, that you cannot easily break the transmission infrastructure down into small catchments. It has to be funded by a wide catchment of Auckland, because there will be benefits to a wider group of people who use that transmission infrastructure, whether it be a major highway or a new pipeline or whatever. Aucklanders will have to fund that, and it will be more than just contributions. North Shore City Council tried to use contributions disproportionately to fund the Northern Busway. It was subject to judicial review, and the developers won. So that's a very important point, and the jurisprudence has been established. Your Worship, notwithstanding that, if Housing New Zealand develop a whole suite of new townhouses within a precinct, Housing New Zealand can reasonably expect, and we should ensure, that they do fund the traffic islands, the light controlled crossings, what have you. They will make a fair and proportionate contribution to that, and Auckland Transport has to provide for that. Your Worship, one of the things about this policy, and it's where this council is vulnerable, is on the issue of the break-even point that's critical to determining the allocation of cost for growth versus the backlog. Because when you look at a lot of these projects, there's a lot of backlog, there's stuff that hasn't been done previously, and to try and retrospectively fund that backlog through contributions is not something we can do. So we will have to demonstrate that we are making good on our asset management plans to bring dilapidated playgrounds and halls and facilities back to a standard that's appropriate for communities. The final thing I want to say, Your Worship, is with respect to parks. And I think that this is where causation and benefits received gets really hard, that local parks that are delivered as part of a new development can be relatively easily identified as a benefit for new communities as part of a new development. But it gets really, really hard at regional parks, because it will be a much wider constituency of Aucklanders that benefit from a new regional park than just a new group of people who have come here. So that is why the majority of costs in relation to regional parks, acquisition of regional parks, that will have to be funded by all of Aucklanders. Contributions will contribute to that somewhat, but I think that the cost will sit primarily with the existing constituency of Aucklanders through rates. So, Your Worship, I'm happy to have this consultation with the development community, but I am pleased that we've moved the date out to the 23rd of November, because we will have to be seen to be taking seriously the submissions that we receive, which I'm sure will be comprehensive and which will address the principles that the court has previously set.
Thank you. Councillor Simpson, last comment. Oh, sorry, Councillor Cashmore after that.
We look the same. No, I didn't have a comment. I just said it wasn't me.
Oh, it wasn't you? Okay. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thanks. I think, and I agree with Councillor Newman on many of these areas. And we have some big variances that the developers haven't seen before, with the costs generally standardised. And for instance, we've got a Papakura Manurewa DC that's going up to 42,000 as compared to neighbouring Manukau at 22,000. And there's going to be some shocks to the systems out there. And at some point, I want to see the breakdown for things like Mill Road, for instance, or Penlink, because the actual benefit doesn't just lie with your proximity community, it lies over the whole city, especially with the areas that are major infrastructure routes like Mill Road with 10 million tonnes of aggregate helping build the city centre. So I'd like to think there's a big contribution flying back that way. So the question I'd like to answer, Andrew or Ross, is that are the developers aware of the amount of variance this new policy is going to bring in?
So some of that the overall increase and some of that variance will have been clear to the developers when we initially spoke with them in May, because there were variances then that we referred to in our advice to you. I think it was different examples, but they were there. So yes, they'll have an inkling that that was coming, although some of the detail and where that variance is will have changed now that we've generated a policy with the greater detail they required.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Clove.
Yeah, no comment other than I just want to thank the team, Andrew and Ross and Bobby and others for the work they did on this.
Complex.
I think it's very good and very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Darby.
And just briefly, I also acknowledge the team as I did before, but I think as we get into this, I still need greater clarity about how those costs fall in the greenfields areas. And I've cited the Mill Road project. It is really a state highway, and I thought we were going to push for that project to be transferred to the state, to the Crown. I think we've taken the foot off the pedal on that one, and in doing so, we're incurring a $500 million tab. But that basically goes from Pukekohe all the way right up to Manurewa and Manukau. And it's and when I see that, and it's always been talked about as a growth-related project, yet only 31% of it is going to be covered by DCs. I'm not convinced that that reflects where the costs and the causation really is for that road. I've heard echoed in this chamber that it is one of the most important growth-related projects, yet the costs are falling to the tune of 69% from other sources. The other sources is existing ratepayers. So I'm concerned about that. The same for Penlink. And when I examine some of the greenfields costs and where they fall, I look at the new category of Drury South. All I can see is one $10 million project for Drury South. So it looks like there's a category that's going to pay a bit more, but when you come to the cost line, it's only a $10 million project. So I'm going to be looking at what we do get back in submissions here, but I think we'll hear from our public that they want a better breakdown and some even more transparency, particularly on the greenfields projects in the transport area I'm mainly referring to. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Well, we're going to, obviously, when this comes back to us, we're going to be looking at the same issues, but with the basis of information, of feedback, and any expressions of concern. And as I said before, our officers will be listening to those concerns, and where a case is made out, making changes. We have to keep within the law, we have to follow the guidelines, and equally developers and the people who benefit from developers are going to have to pay their share. So the recommendations are before you, which is to agree to consult and with delegated authority to the Chair of Finance and Performance and the CFO and the consultation process. So I'll put that resolution. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. We come to item 10, which is to note that in confidential we will be having a discussion about the process of shareholder approval for the Wynyard Quarter. I think we can keep our debate to confidential unless there's any desire to ask questions before then. So I'll move accordingly. Seconded by Councillor Fletcher. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried.
I'd like to record my vote against.
Okay, in this session,
It was meant to be about public consultation, and we're going into secrecy.
Well, there's a reason for that, councillor, and you can vote against the confidential motion if you choose.
It's Orwellian.
And the reason is that the report contains sensitive information about a commercial transaction. So I'll move that we exclude the public for the discussion of confidential item number 1. Those been seconded by Councillor Clow. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no.
Recorded,
Carried.
please.
Recorded, Councillors Lee and Watson